CJ, what's your gut telling you what the Leafs want to do? Do they want to add a big, tough defenseman? Do they want a skilled winger? Like, what do you think their needs are in priority?
Well, I've been pretty locked in on thinking that they would devote most of their assets or their cap space to a forward. That seemed to make sense to me. There was, some consistent reporting that kind of suggested that way. But I will say that I had someone this week who I was speaking with who's, fairly at least semi in the loop on the thinking there. And he insists that he thinks that they're going to make a move, a primary move to address the defense. And I think the truth of the matter is, I don't think they're locked in on just one thing. I think that it's a case where, they're sitting back, they're surveying the entire market, both defense and forwards, getting a sense of what the costs are going to be. And then as it gets closer to March 3rd, they're going to make a choice about where they think that what move would bring them the most impact. And so I don't know at this point in time that it has to be a top six forward, that it has to be, a defenseman maybe that brings a little bit more abrasiveness that can play in your top four. I think that they're kind of keeping an open mind about it. And truthfully, when all is said and done, the dust settles, I wouldn't be surprised if they've brought in a player for each position. Now, are we talking a depth guy or someone that moves the needle? I think that's really the question. It hasn't really been in Kyle Dubas' nature. I know there was the 1 year they traded the first rounder for Nick Foligno a couple years back, but by and large, they haven't gone huge with the prices that they've paid for rentals. And, if that continues to be the case, then I just don't see them being in on the biggest names, the names that are right at the top of that trade bait board that TSN put out.
CJ, we discussed this at length the last couple of days about, Dubas maybe going all in a lot of different ways. Do you not feel that, with what you have right now, John Tavares at 32 years old, having a great season, William Nylander having a career season, Mitch Marner as well, and we know what Austin Matthews is capable of, does it not have to be a scenario where you kind of got to go all in? And I know you said that's not been Kyle's, MO, I guess, basically in the last couple of years. But don't you feel like a guy like Nyes, if you can get a king's ransom back, like, shouldn't it be kind of everything out the window and you got to make your team a lot better if you feel you got a chance here to compete?
I can see that argument. I just don't think it's the way Kyle Dubas thinks. I know for a fact, like last year, it took a long time for that Mark Giordano trade to come together. Remember a first rounder went from the Panthers to get Ben Sherratt in the lead up to that deadline. Like the Leafs hung around to the end to see what they could best in their view get for a second round pick. They were not giving up a first rounder for a player on an expiring contract. And, that specific example worked out well because, look at the Panthers. They traded this year's first and next year's for Sherratt and Giroux and got one playoff round out of it and lost in round two pretty easily. And now they're sitting here out of the playoffs and they don't own their first round pick. I think that Kyle doesn't want to, for a rental, do that. Now, maybe there's some guys out there that have term and it's a little different calculus, but I just think he thinks it's too random that, for 20 regular season games, give or take, and no more than 28 in the playoffs at the absolute most to give up that kind of a return. So, I'm not going to say and put my career on it and say he would never do it, but that's just not how he thinks. And so that would represent a change of his philosophy and approach if he were ever to swing big and do something like that.
Yeah, and I think that what a lot of people listening to this conversation would be thinking, and it's what I'm thinking right now, is, well, he's in the final year of his deal, and you would think every year it's even more desperate. You got to win. Yet at the same time, if he's constantly being evaluated and he's confident in the way he operates, I kind of understand where you're going with that, Chris. Like, if he's saying to Shanahan and company, I know what I'm doing, I'm the man for the job, I'm not going to freak out to prove something differently. In other words, if he is philosophically set on an approach at the deadline, he probably shouldn't change it just to prove that he can or he will.
Right. Like, in his mind, he's not auditioning for anything here, right? They should know exactly what he is. I think, obviously as you go along, he's now in his fifth year as a GM and longer than that in the front office. He learns things and maybe you have a thought and you change and adjust over time. But I think he's going to stay true to himself, honestly, and let the chips fall where they may. I mean, the Leafs have played, each of those 5 years, I'm pretty sure they played in one game where if they won the game that night, they would have went to the second round and unfortunately came up with losses in all of them. But they have been right there, and here we are again talking. They're at the top of the standings. They're pretty close to it in the league in points percentage. I just think that he's not going to do anything too dramatic. Now, look, I might be wrong, but if he does, I will say it's a big surprise. I think he's going to stick to the plan he's done. He's believed in it. He's believed in this core group. But we all know the stakes are different this year. I mean, it's probably been said in the past. I think this year it's quite true. I mean, there's so few players on the team that are signed beyond the season. Even a couple of the ones that are eligible for extensions, and Nylander and Matthews as of July 1st. Kyle Dubas himself doesn't have a contract. I mean, this could be a make or break type of season, but I'm not sure that that's going to alter the way that Dubas himself approaches the decisions he's got here in the next month.
Well, that was where I was going to go, and it's, again, we're not privy to the information, but there is potentially massive change on the horizon if individual players decide that they want to move on. And, it's easy to go, well, Matthew Tkachuk left Calgary, so, maybe Matthews does that. I don't believe that personally, but there is a lot of uncertainty moving forward. That's why I feel like this is a real critical season for a guy like Kyle to kind of push the chips in and go, I'm gonna not basically do everything I can to compete against Boston, compete against Tampa, because I don't know what my roster construction is going to look like 18 months from now with some of the options that are on the table. Like Willie can just walk if he wants to.
I was going to say, nobody's talked about it, Noodles, but Willie can do the same thing. He can pull a Matthew Tkachuk and say, I'm probably not going to resign here.
Yeah. And he could also just play out next year. They could look at trade him at the deadline. There's a lot of different ways this could go. I mean, Matthews is different in my estimation. If they're not announcing a contract extension on or about July 1st, and I think you have to be having a conversation about moving him right away. I just don't think that's a player you bring back into a contract here in a market like Toronto. I mean, It could happen elsewhere, right? David Pasternak, one of the best players in the league, is doing it right now in Boston. It's not really causing that much noise or distraction, but it's a different beast when we're talking about the Leafs and we're talking about a player like Matthews. So I think that decision has to come July 1st. The Nylander one, there might be a little bit more wiggle room, and then we really have to know who's making the decision, right? That's where it starts. I mean, if some alternate world, if they're not extending Kyle Dubas, they're bringing someone else in. I mean, we don't know how that person would do those choices either. So it's going to be crazy. Like whenever the playoffs end, I don't know if it's at the end of the first round or if it's with a Stanley Cup being paraded around Bay Street. But either way, the days after when the season ends will be pretty dramatic in terms of how the Leafs approach that, what they do with Dubas, and then ultimately what that means for some of the core members of the team.